Hi everyone, welcome back to class. This week we're talking about some real-world ethical questions. So we're talking about abortion and we're talking about the death penalty. There'll be just two videos this week. The first video is this one, we'll talk about abortion, and the next video we'll talk about the death penalty. And what I want to talk about in this first video about abortion is a specific argument, which comes from a philosopher named Judith Jarvis Thomson, who taught at MIT for most of the second half of the 20th century and did a lot of work in a lot of different fields of philosophy. A lot of the work on the trolley problem that's been done in the last 50 years was done by Judith Jarvis Thomson. She's the one she didn't invent the original trolley problem, but she invented the bridge version and the organ version and lots of other different versions. And a lot of the discussion about it can trace its roots back to her. So she's a really cool philosopher, and she has this argument about abortion. She's defending abortion and arguing against a certain argument against abortion. But her argument is interesting because it turns on a completely different issue than most of the arguments for and against abortion that most of us here turn on. So the usual debate about abortion comes down to whether or not life begins at conception. Well, first of all, the question is usually in politics, because unfortunately, that's where we hold most of our moral arguments as a society, is in sort of the politics realm. We talk about what the law should or shouldn't say based on what should or shouldn't be legal to do, based on what it is or isn't morally acceptable or morally permissible to do. So it's often about whether or not it's legal. And I'm going to put the law question to the side here, as we're going to do throughout this class, because what the law should say is a little different than what we should or shouldn't do. You might think sometimes it's morally okay to break the law, like when, say, Harriet Tubman helped people escape slavery. That was technically illegal. Morally pretty good, though. So you can break the law and do something morally right. You can follow the law and do something morally wrong. Nazi Germany, for example. And so the law, we're going to sort of push to the side. That's not our focus. That's not our subject. What we want to talk about is what it's morally right or wrong to do. So we're going to ask if abortion is ever permissible, morally, regardless of whether or not it's legal. Is it morally permissible? And the political debate is often based on, implicitly or explicitly, it's based on the morality question. People who think abortion should be totally illegal usually think it should be illegal because abortion's morally impermissible. And most, but not all, people who think abortion should be legal think that abortion should be legal because it's not morally wrong in all cases, and the law should only stop you from doing things that are morally wrong. Some people think it's morally wrong but should be legal because of certain consequences. That's a whole other issue that we won't talk about. So the debate's usually about whether or not abortion should be legal, and more importantly, it's usually centered on whether or not life begins at conception. That is the core issue most of the time in debates and discussions about abortion. Does life begin at conception? Usually, anti-legal abortion people who are opposed to abortion being legal, people who think abortion should always be illegal, they think life begins at conception. Pro-life is the preferred term that they call themselves. They think life begins at conception, generally. And pro-legal abortion people who are in favor of abortion being legal, at least in some cases, I think pro-choice is their preferred term. Pro-choice people think that life does not begin at conception. And so a lot of the time, the debate is on whether or not life begins at conception. And the thinking goes something like this. This is sort of why when life begins becomes the core issue that people talk about. Because the thinking is, well, if life begins at conception, then the fetus or embryo is a person and has a right to life. People have a right to life. They have a right to keep living. Uh, an abortion will kill the fetus or the embryo and therefore violate its right to life. And therefore, abortion is morally wrong. That's sort of the argument. That's the general thinking. If life begins at conception, then abortion is killing a person, which is wrong. A person has a right to life. You can't kill them. It's morally wrong to kill them. So abortion is morally wrong. It kills something that has a right to life. But if life doesn't begin until later, until after conception, then at least at some point, the fetus or embryo is not a person and therefore does not have a person's right to life. And so killing it via abortion would be morally no worse or no different than killing plants or bacteria or other non-sentient life. If there is some stage during the early parts of a pregnancy where the embryo does not count as a sentient being, then it is okay to kill it, even if it's cellularly alive, for the same reason that it's okay to kill plants and bacteria and other non-sentient life. We usually think bacteria and plants don't have a right to life because they're not sentient living things the way that people and arguably animals are. So, if life begins at conception, it looks like abortion is morally wrong. If life doesn't begin until later, then, at least during the stage before life begins, abortion is not morally wrong. And that's the thinking. And this is what Thomson is going to deny. So Thomson's trying to argue against people who say abortion is never morally permissible. And the argument that abortion is never morally permissible says that a fetus is a living person, or an embryo is a living person, and therefore has a right to life, and therefore morally cannot be killed. I mean, obviously, like physically it can be killed. It's not Superman. But morally it cannot be killed. And so Thomson wants to show that this argument is incorrect. Thomson is trying to provide a defense of abortion, specifically a defense against this sort of argument. And she's trying to show this argument is incorrect, and therefore abortion can, at least in some cases, be permissible, could be morally okay. You don't have a moral obligation not to do it. So the usual argument against abortion, just so we have the argument sort of in our view, goes something like this. It says, look, the fetus is a living person. Life begins at conception, so fetus, embryo, whatever stage, is a living person. And if it's a living person, then it has a right to life. All persons have a right to life. Now, the mother has a right to decide what to do with their body, but that right does not outweigh the fetus's right to life. The right to life is stronger than the right to control your own body. You know, no one's going to run around saying, yes, I understand that the person I stabbed had a right to life, but I have a right to control my body and do what I want to do with my body. And what I wanted to do with my body was jam my arm forward with a knife in my hand. So it's not murder. I didn't violate the right to life. I had a right to control my body. Like no one thinks that that's a good argument. Everyone sort of agrees that your right to control your own body has some limits on it. Like you can't it's morally wrong for you to use your body to strangle another person to death. Technically, that's a limit on what you can do with your body. You can't use your body and your hands to strangle someone to death. But we're all on board with that, right? We all agree the right to control your own body does not involve a right to kill other people with your body. And so the argument here, step 3 of the argument, is just trying to make that sort of claim. It's saying, look, you have a right to do what you want to do with your own body, but within limits, not if it's involving killing another person and violating another person's right to life. That is not okay. That's step 3 here. So if the fetus has a right to life that isn't outweighed by other rights, then it's wrong to kill the fetus. So this isn't outweighed by other rights, little qualification here. Like you might think in a trolley problem case, the one person has a right to life, but so do the 5 people. And 5 rights to life outweigh 1 right to life. So it's okay to pull the lever. You might think something like that. Or you might think that there are other certain cases where, if an attacker, someone's attacking you, they have a right to life, but so do you. And so you might think killing in self-defense is morally okay because the attacker has a right to life and you have a right to life, but since you didn't start attacking them, they started attacking you, your right to life now outweighs theirs a little bit. They sort of reduced their claim by trying to end your life. You might think something like that. So there might be cases where other rights could outweigh a right to life. And so premise 4 here is just saying, look, if the fetus has a right to life, and it's not one of these cases where it could be outweighed by other rights, then it's wrong to kill the fetus. And therefore, it's wrong to kill the fetus. So we said the fetus is a living person. Therefore, the fetus has a right to life. That right to life is not outweighed by other rights, the right to bodily autonomy. And therefore, it's wrong to kill the fetus. That's sort of the usual argument. That's sort of the general argument for abortion being impermissible in all cases. Because notice, this argument does not leave room for, say, having abortion in cases where the pregnancy is the result of non-consensual encounter, or in case of incest, or other things that oftentimes there are people who say abortion is wrong, except in cases of like rape and incest and things like that. Then it's okay. And this argument doesn't leave room for that sort of view. This argument says, look, the fetus is a living person, and so it's wrong to kill it. How it became a living person, and whatever unpleasant background causes there might be there, though that doesn't undermine the fetus being a living person and therefore having a right to life that it's wrong to violate. So this argument really gives you the conclusion that abortion is never permissible under any circumstances. You are always ending the life of a living person and therefore violating a person's rights and therefore doing something morally wrong. And so this argument really argues for the claim that abortion is never morally permissible. And so therefore abortion is wrong in all cases. That's what this argument gets you. And Thomson thinks that this debate is mistaken and this argument is mistaken, and a lot of this whole picture is based on an error. So she thinks that focusing on whether or not life begins at conception is not what we should be focusing on. That's just sort of an error, that we've been focusing on the wrong thing. We're looking at, does life begin at conception? And she thinks, look, at the end of the day, there's probably no right answer there anyway. She thinks it's that, at the very tail end of a pregnancy, that's pretty clearly, that's basically a baby. The fetus at the very end of the pregnancy, clearly a person with a right to life. She thinks the zygote, the 4-cell initial organism, at the very beginning of the pregnancy, obviously not a sentient person, doesn't have a right to life. And she thinks where in that space, over the course of the pregnancy, the fetus or embryo becomes a person. She says that's just pure vagueness. That's like asking how many hairs you have to lose before you're officially bald, or exactly when on the color palette from going from yellow through every shade all the way to red, like when does it officially become orange? That's vague. There's no precise good answer there. And so Thomson thinks, look, trying to answer that question is just not going to work. There's no real fact of the matter here that you could be right or wrong about. There's no precise moment when it happens. And so this is just this is not a good thing to base our entire debate on. And so Thomson says, look, and this is not a direct quote, this is just me summarizing what Thomson's point is. Thomson says, look, for the sake of argument, let's just say, hypothetically, let's suppose that life does begin at conception, that from the moment of conception, sperm hits egg, boom, you've got a human life, you've got a person. It's a full person with full person's rights. Thomson says, even then, the usual argument against abortion fails. The argument that abortion is never permissible because it violates the fetus's right to life fails, even if we grant that life begins at conception. And that's what Thomson's going to set out to argue. That's what Thomson sets out to argue in her paper and in the summary of her paper that was assigned for the reading for this week. Thomson argues that abortion is morally permissible, at least in some cases. She doesn't want to say it's permissible in every case. She thinks at least in some cases, abortion is morally permissible and would be even if life begins at conception. So whether or not life begins at conception isn't the main issue we should be arguing about. That's not the only question we should be asking. We should be asking, if life begins at conception, then does abortion necessarily and automatically violate the embryo or fetus's right to life? And Thomson's going to argue no, not necessarily. So Thomson offers this thought experiment that's supposed to be sort of an analogy. And she offers this thought experiment to try to get us to think about what a right to life actually entails. So here's the thought experiment. Suppose you wake up in a hospital bed, right? You've been unconscious and now you are waking up. You're in a hospital bed. You don't know how you got there. And on this, while you're lying on this hospital bed and waking up, you realize your body is hooked up through tubes and wires and the little thing that they stick into your vein, little smaller tubes, lots of tubes and machines, hooking your body up to an unconscious violinist, a famous violinist, if violinists can still be famous nowadays. So an unconscious violinist lying in the bed next to you, and your body is hooked up to their body. And the doctor comes in and explains to you that this violinist has a deadly disease, and the disease will kill him if nothing is done to save him. So the violinist has a deadly disease. If nothing is done, the violinist will die. Now, a group of the violinist's fans discovered that you're the only person with the right blood type necessary to save the violinist's life. You're the only person who can save the violinist's life. So they kidnapped you. They plugged you into the violinist with all the various tubes and whatnot. And the violinist's body is now using your organs to function and to keep him alive. Your kidneys are filtering water in his body, just like they're filtering water in your body. Your heart is pumping blood through your veins and through the violinist's veins. Your organs are keeping both of you alive. So you're going to survive still. You're going to be fine. You're not like losing your organs permanently. But your body is keeping you alive, and it's right now keeping the violinist alive. So in order to survive this disease, this deadly, deadly disease the violinist has, the violinist needs to stay hooked up to your body for the next 9 months. 9 months is the amount of time it's going to take for the violinist's body to overcome this disease and start functioning healthily and normally so that the violinist can go on and live a normal life. So if you stay plugged into this violinist for 9 months, your organs will keep both of you alive the whole time and give the violinist's body a chance to overcome the disease. After that 9 months, the violinist will be completely recovered, can be unplugged from you, you can be unplugged from the violinist, and you can both go on and live your separate lives, and you never have to see each other again if you don't want to. You two can go your separate ways after these 9 months. So if you stay for 9 months with the violinist's body hooked up to yours, the violinist will survive and be able to live a normal life. If you unplug yourself from the violinist before then, the violinist will die. The violinist's body cannot keep itself alive before it finishes fighting off this disease. And so the disease will take the body, or will take the violinist will die. The violinist's body will not be able to keep him alive if you unplug, and he will die. So the question is, do you have a moral obligation to stay hooked up to the violinist? Or is it morally permissible for you to unplug yourself from the violinist's body? That's the thought experiment. That's the question. So, do you have to stay plugged into the violinist, or can you unplug yourself? And there's two different questions here we might ask. One is, what is like morally the best thing you could do? What's the nicest thing you could do? What's the kindest thing you could do? And the answer to that question is pretty clearly stay hooked up to the violinist. Like, that's the nicer thing to do here. That is the kinder thing for you to do. But that's a different question than what your moral obligations are. What are the things it would be morally wrong for you to do? Like, for example, charity is better than not giving to charity. Giving to charity is better than not giving to charity, morally speaking. But most people would say you're not morally obligated to give to charity. So what we want to ask here is not just what it's morally best to do, but we want to know, what are your real obligations? Do you have to stay plugged into the violinist, morally speaking? Or is it morally acceptable for you to unplug from the violinist? Morally permissible, meaning morally permitted, meaning allowable. It's morally okay. That's all morally permissible means. So Thomson says you can unplug from the violinist. That's Thomson's view. Thomson says you can unplug from the violinist. It is morally permissible to unplug yourself from the violinist's body. She says, look, it might be nice to stay plugged in, strictly speaking. That might be better than unplugging yourself. It's kinder, certainly, but you're not obligated to stay plugged into the violinist. It's not a moral requirement or a moral duty. It's not something you absolutely have to do, morally speaking. It's just something it would be kind to do, but you don't have to do it. It's like donating to charity. It's nice, and it's probably better than not donating morally, but you don't have a moral obligation to do so, most people think. We'll see an argument that you do have a moral obligation to give to charity later in this course. But most people would say it's not morally required. It's just morally nice or something like that. But Thomson thinks you can unplug from the violinist. And note, the violinist is uncontroversially a person. Well, it might be controversial whether or not an embryo is a person, but a violinist is uncontroversial. That's a person. There's no doubt there. There's no question whether or not this is a person. Of course it's a person. You know, plants can't play the violin. This is a human person. And so the violinist has a right to life. Unquestionably. If anyone has a right to life, if any people have a right to life, the violinist has a right to life. And unplugging yourself from the violinist ends the violinist's life. So the violinist has a right to life, and unplugging yourself from the violinist will end the violinist's life. And Thomson agrees with this. Thomson thinks this is true. Both of these are true. The violinist has a right to life, and unplugging yourself from the violinist ends the violinist's life. She accepts both of these. But she still says it's morally permissible to unplug yourself from the violinist. It looks like unplugging yourself might violate the violinist's rights. The violinist has a right to life. You're going to unplug from the violinist knowing that it will result in the violinist's death. That sounds like you might be violating his right to life. However, Thomson says that the violinist's right to life does not mean that he has a right to use your body to sustain his life. The violinist does not have the right to use your body as he needs it in order to keep surviving. Thomson says that the violinist's right to life is a right not to be killed. Your right to life is a right not to be murdered, basically. But it's not a right to take whatever you need in order to stay alive. It's not a right to keep yourself alive by any means necessary. That's not what your right to life is. Thomson says you have a right to your own body, and you have a right to determine what happens to your body. That's your right. So if you do not want the violinist to use your body in order to stay alive, then you have a right to deprive the violinist of access to your body. The violinist does not have a right to your body, only you do. So if you don't want to provide access to your body to this violinist, then you do not have to. Thomson says you have the freedom to deprive other people of access to your body. And so the violinist has a right to life, but not a right to use your body to stay alive. And so if you remove access to your body, you do not thereby violate the violinist's rights. The violinist does not have a right to use your body to keep him alive. And so by removing access to your body, you're not violating any of his rights. You're taking away access to your body, but access to your body is not something the violinist has a right to in the first place. So your right to control your own body and determine who has access to it means that you can remove access and not violate the violinist's rights. So Thomson thinks that having a right to life does not mean that you are owed anything and everything that would be necessary to keep you alive. You're not owed whatever it takes to keep you alive. And therefore, she thinks, it's possible to make a decision that you know will end someone's life without thereby violating their right to life. Because you might be just taking away something that they don't have a right to in the first place. And that's okay, Thomson thinks. It's morally permissible to deprive people of access to things that they don't have a right to and that you have the right to control. And your body is one of those things. You have the right to control your body, and other people do not have the right to access it whenever they feel they need it. And therefore, you can remove access to your body from the violinist, and you're not violating the violinist's rights when you do so. And Thomson thinks this is one of those cases where you can know that this will cause someone's death and still do it and be morally okay. You know that unplugging your body from the violinist will cause the violinist to die. But all you're doing is removing access to something the violinist is not owed, does not have a right to. And so your unplugging does not violate the violinist's right to life. I mean, if you stabbed him to death, that would violate his right to life. But removing access to something that he needs and that he doesn't have a right to is not the same thing as stabbing him to death. It's not violating his right to life the way that stabbing him would. It's just cutting off access to something that he doesn't have a right to access. And so Thomson thinks that this violinist case should illustrate that a right to life does not mean a right to anything and everything that would keep you alive. And she thinks abortion is analogous to the violinist case. And that abortion is also one of these cases where you can deprive access without violating the right to life. So Thomson says if life begins at conception, then the embryo, fetus, whichever stage, has a right to life. But the right to life does not mean that the fetus is owed anything and everything necessary to keep it alive. The fetus has a right to life, but does not necessarily have a right to use the mother's body to gestate and stay alive. So the fetus can have a right to life, can have a right not to be killed, but that doesn't automatically mean the fetus has a right to use the mother's body to keep it alive for as long as it needs. That's a very different right, and it's a right the fetus doesn't necessarily have. So therefore, at least in some cases, it's morally permissible for the mother to disconnect the fetus from her body and deprive the fetus of access to her body. And in doing so, the fetus will die. That's what abortions are. It's depriving an embryo or fetus or whichever stage from access to the mother's body, and it thereby ceases to live. That's what an abortion is. And so in depriving the embryo of access to your body, the fetus will die because the fetus, embryo, whatever, needs access to your body in order to stay alive. It can't survive on its own. It needs access to your body in order to continue living. But removing it from your body does not necessarily violate its right to life. You've refused to allow the fetus or embryo to use your body to keep it alive, but it doesn't necessarily have a right to use your body to keep itself alive. You have the right to your body and to decide who has access to it. And so the fetus's right to life does not necessarily mean it has a right to use your body in order to stay alive. It has a right not to be killed, it has a right not to be murdered, but it doesn't have a right to use your body to continue its life, to prolong its life. It's not owed access to your organs. So if you remove its access to your organs, you haven't violated its rights. It will die as a result, but you haven't violated its rights. All you've done is remove its access to your organs, which it did not have a right to access. And so Thomson thinks, at least in some cases, when the fetus does not have a right to use the mother's body to keep itself alive, abortion will be sometimes morally permissible. The fetus does not necessarily have a right to use the mother's body to keep itself alive. There may be some cases where it does, but there are at least some cases where it doesn't. And in those cases where it doesn't, depriving the fetus of access to your body does not violate its rights. And so it's not morally wrong to do so. Because it's not morally wrong to remove someone's access to something that they don't have a right to access. That's not morally forbidden. And so it's therefore morally permissible, at least sometimes, to deprive the embryo or fetus of access to the mother's body, i.e., to perform an abortion. That's what abortion is. It's depriving the embryo or fetus of access to someone else's body. And so the usual argument against abortion that we looked at the start of the video is meant to show that abortion is always impermissible because it always violates the fetus's right to life. The fetus If life begins at conception, then the fetus or embryo is always a person. People always have a right to life. So any killing of the fetus will violate its right to life and will therefore be morally wrong. So abortions are always morally wrong. But Thomson's argument tries to show that abortion does not necessarily violate the fetus's right to life. It's possible to remove the fetus from accessing the mother's body without violating the fetus's right to life. And so abortion is not necessarily morally wrong because it doesn't necessarily violate anyone's rights. And so Thomson does not think that abortion is always permissible. She thinks at least in some cases it's permissible. But in some cases, she says it will be morally wrong. She says, for example, that terminating a late stage pregnancy because it interferes with your vacation plans would be morally reprehensible. She called it obviously reprehensible. She says that's clearly wrong. So it's not just, this isn't just a blank check, free and clear, whenever you want, abort away. She's saying, or she's arguing that there are at least some cases where it's morally permissible. If the pregnancy were planned and intentional and posed no health problems for the mother, then arguably the fetus might have a right to the mother's body. The fetus is sort of like an invited guest in that case. And so if you intentionally create the embryo and bring it into your body and then remove its access, killing it, that might be morally wrong. Even given Thomson's defense, if we accept Thomson's defense, we might think that is still morally wrong. But Thomson thinks that at least in some cases, it is morally permissible. Even if some cases of abortion are morally wrong on Thomson's view, but at least some cases are morally fine. In unplanned or unwanted pregnancies or pregnancies caused by non-consensual sex, the fetus is not an invited guest. The fetus does not have a right to use the mother's body. It does not have a right, is not owed access to your body. And in those cases, Thomson thinks abortion is permissible. And it does not violate the fetus's right to life, even if life begins at conception. Now, Thomson thinks life doesn't actually begin at conception, but she's saying, look, for the sake of argument, even if it did, abortion would still be permissible in at least some cases. And that is Thomson's defense of abortion. So that's her argument. If you have any questions about it, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video, and we will talk about the death penalty now.